This is Peter,
And this is Tom.
and you're listening to History Teachers Talking Podcasts. All right, this is Peter Zablocki and Thomas Reska, and welcome back to the podcast. Tom, what do we got today?
Today, with all the recent events that's been going on in the country in 2020, and everyone's saying how 2020 is a year they can't wait to get over and how crazy it is, we're going to look back at another year that was just as crazy and had just as much just major events that shaped the world, and that would be 1968.
So 1968 was one of those years, infamous years in American history that a lot of people tend to want to forget. It seemed that absolutely nothing went right in 1968 for our nation, as
It
well
was
as the world, but
definitely a black eye for the United States that whole year.
absolutely. And recent times, in the past few months with Corona starting, I actually see a lot of comparisons being made in the media between 68 and 2020. The Atlantic just came out a couple months ago with an article they called "Is This the Worst Year in Modern American History?" comparing 2020 to 1968. So, why don't we do that? Why don't we try to compare 68 and kind of talk about the other year?
That's what we do, right, Pete?
That's what we do. That's right.
History repeats itself, and it's definitely repeating in a lot of ways. I know you had your little article, not little, I apologize, but your article that was talking about how with the pandemic and the pandemic of 1919,
Yep.
right? You can find that online, guys. Just Google Peter Zablocki. You'll find a whole bunch of cool stuff. But
I did have an article that compared it to
but
papers,
1968 is another one where, although you don't have a pandemic exactly, there's a lot of political turmoil. Probably up to that point, the most political turmoil you've seen in the country since the Civil War, I would say.
Yeah, but you don't have the pandemic, but you have thousands of Americans dying.
Dying for another reason. For Vietnam. It's really in what we'll get into, but I'm sure that's really the year. This is the year 1968 where that anti-Vietnam movement really starts to take hold. It's really when the public starts to turn against the Vietnam War. Up until that, it was all pro-Vietnam War for the most part. Like, I'm generalizing there, but really after what we'll talk about here, what happens in 1968, that really starts to change.
Yeah, so you know what? Why don't we start with Vietnam? I'm thinking maybe we could provide some context. So I was going to kind of start talking about just Vietnam up to that point, and also talk about the civil rights movement up to that point to kind of create context.
Give a little bit of information here.
We could start with Vietnam, which is an extremely divisive war in American history.
Yeah, it's one that's still being talked about. Like, as far as like, what's the narrative on it? Like, what do you really want to teach? Because it's when you look at it, it's not in. If you want to look at like militarily, did we accomplish our objective? No, but did we lose any battles? No. So it's very complicated, and it's still a lot of like the consequences that still take place there in Vietnam and abroad are still major from this conflict.
Yeah. And also keep in mind that the wars prior to it, when you have World War II and even Korea, to a large extent, were very patriotic wars. And people, when they were drafted to go in, kind of took it as, all right, it's my duty and it's time to go. And this is what's different about Vietnam is that, it's completely
hasn't been a draft since Vietnam. That's not a coincidence.
Yeah, not a coincidence. And actually, and the first war that we went into afterwards was, Persian Gulf War in 1991. And, President H.W. Bush actually said this will not be another Vietnam. Again,
that's what they always want to avoid. They always say we don't want this to be Vietnam, like everything's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? We don't want this to be another Vietnam, even though it's actually been longer than Vietnam at this point. Yeah. But what we're going to be talking about today is really when that kind of changes. That actually happens in January, so it's a good way to start, right? The beginning of 1968 is also one of these events where kind of shifts the narrative on the Vietnam War in the U.S.
Kind of just before you get into that, Tom, which is, again, very important, we need to bring this idea that the Vietnam War was very much a working class war. You got a deferment, you got a college deferment from being drafted if you went to college, at least initially. And that kind of, we'll get into why that changed a little bit later. But most of the people that attended college at this time were white and financially well off. I mean, statistics, don't lie in that sense. So most of the people that fought in Vietnam were lower class whites and minorities. About 80% of American soldiers came from lower economic levels.
So that's the song, right? Fortunate son, right?
Yep. Therefore, making Vietnam a working class war. And because of that, because African Americans were, again, civil rights movement is kind of splintering at this point, which we'll get into as well in context. A lot of the people that are being drafted are African American.
And young. And that's another thing too. Very young.
Very young. There are kids.
Average age of what, 19, 20, I think was like the average age.
Absolutely. It said that African Americans accounted for about 20% of all American combat deaths, despite the fact that they're only made up 10% of the entire US population. MLK, very, very known civil rights leader at the time, kind of holding back, not talking about against Vietnam. He doesn't want to talk about Vietnam. He doesn't want to do it. And in 67, so right before the events that we're about to talk about, he finally breaks down and he has to address the fact that so many people and so many African Americans are dying in Vietnam. I have a quote from him where he says, "We are taking the young black men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. We have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to see them together in the same schools." That kind of brings it, the picture and how divisive this is becoming. There is a humongous movement that's growing that's essentially an anti-war movement. And it starts off kind of really in colleges. And again, this is just to provide context of when, things kind of get really messy in 68. So you have the New Left movement and you have the Students for Democratic Society, and they kind of were against this idea that they thought that corporations and large government institutions had taken over America, and they wanted greater individual freedom.
Sound
Ironic.
familiar? Sound
Yeah,
familiar?
ironic, right? Ironic.
Exactly. Yeah. This is the birth of a lot of that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
yeah.
these guys are kind of going against this big government and against these corporations and kind of fighting for the little guy. And it starts off with campus activism. So, dress codes, curfews, dormitory regulations, stuff like that. But then the protest kind of shifts and it shifts into, kind of just overall against, you have young people going against government policies and government as a whole and establishment. The protests grow and grow. And then in February of 1966, Johnson's administration kind of changes the deferment for college students trying to get out of the draft. And it required students to be in good academic standing in order to be granted a deferment. And that kind of led to campuses around the country just erupting in protests. March in Washington in 65, 20,000 protesters. Another march in November of that same year, 65, in Washington, also drew 30,000. So it seems like when you put the TV on, if you're not looking at pictures of the war and death and
And that's what was on TV
destruction,
every night too. Like the
yeah,
Vietnam War was a war that was televised. They would actually do it almost like today. If you were like a sporting event, and they give like the score. They would give like you'd watch the news and they give like a score, like our body count, how many of our soldiers died, how many Viet Cong were killed.
yep,
And that's kind of what we're going in here because every day they're seeing that there's more and more of these Viet Cong Vietnamese soldiers being killed. Oh, we have to be winning this war. We has to be over. And they're telling the American public any day now this war is going to be over. It's coming to an end. It's coming to an end. The boys are going to be coming home. And then 1968 changes that narrative.
yep.
Well, on January 30th, 1968, the North Vietnamese launched what becomes known as the Tet Offensive against the United States and South Vietnamese. And it's like I said, it was kind of signified the beginning of the end of the U.S. involvement. This is when the protests really started to take off after this. The Viet Cong, which are the Vietnamese communists, they coordinate an attack by over 85,000 of them, coordinate this massive attack on 36 major cities in South Vietnam, and it caught the U.S.-led forces totally by surprise. And it's because it happened during the Vietnamese holiday of Tet, which is almost like their New Year.
Mm-hmm.
And normally it was one of these, it was a Lunar New Year. It was one of these times where like both sides kind of had this like unofficial ceasefire.
Mm-hmm.
So they really weren't expecting an attack. And the reason and eventually the U.S., they do take back all of these, the towns and all the city, all the land that
Quickly,
they
very
lost
quickly, actually.
very
Yeah,
quickly. But showing this on the news and like, if we're about to beat them, how are they able to mass this sort of attack? And
correct.
if they're supposed to be backwards and not know what's going on, how do they
Yeah, they
coordinate
said
an
a bunch
attack
of villagers,
this size?
running around. They
Yeah,
couldn't, and all of a sudden they coordinate. Like you're saying, Tom, they coordinate an attack. Like
yeah. So it
the
was a huge wake
narrative.
up call. And then
Yeah, the
the people
narrative
back
is
home
kind
were
of
like,
false.
the people at home are like, there's no way. They're like, is the government lying to us? Like,
Yep.
remember, this is the 1960s. You have some of that, but it's still that whole like the government would never do that. The Watergate hasn't happened yet. So that's really what makes people start to become aware of the government. I'm sure we'll do something on that in the future.
Yeah.
But it's really like, so what we're being told isn't necessarily the truth, and it's a real wake up call, like you said. And it happens first at the colleges, but then it starts to get into a lot of the mainstream America too during this time because they're just like, this war is not going to be over. we've been in the we've had troops there since the 50s, really, right?
Yep.
And they're just like, and it really started to escalate more with Johnson. But now they're just like, this is just crazy. Like, this war is not going to be over. More of these young boys are going to come home, kill, in body bags or maimed, which is something that we can get to another time. I'm sure. I don't have to waste time
Yep.
with it today. But remember, that was the Viet Cong strategy. They didn't necessarily want to kill you. They wanted to maim you. They wanted to send these boys home, missing arms, missing legs, so that would scare the other people and scare the mothers. That was what they would say. Like, the mothers aren't going to want to send their sons to war to come home missing arms and legs. So that was like their strategy.
Think about it. You have very similar to what we have today is just complete distrust in government, and not just distrust, but almost like a disgust in government. In October of '67, again, so we're getting closer. Now Tet Offensive happens in January of '68, so almost like '68 just starts off bad.
Yeah.
But right before, in October of '67, there was a demonstration at Washington's Lincoln Memorial that drew 75,000 protesters. Right, there was speeches. There was like 30,000 demonstrators. At the end of this, decided to lock arms and march in the Pentagon. So they do. They march in the Pentagon, and once they get there, they kind of broke past the military that was protecting the Pentagon, and they mounted the steps, and they were met by tear gas and clubs, and about 1,500 demonstrators were injured and at least 700 arrested. What you see today is essentially happening here. You have a military hitting protesters and using tear gas against protesters. There's this distinction between, well, are we talking about rioters or are we talking about protesters? Is there a difference? And there is a difference. And that's kind of what's coming out at this time, specifically becomes intensified because of the Tet Offensive. Like, government is not necessarily honest with us. New York Times did a poll, and we have to mention New York Times is kind of more
It's
liberal.
more liberal, yeah.
Yeah.
Even then, especially
Yep.
now.
But so they did a poll right before the Tet Offensive, and it showed that 28% of Americans called themselves doves, meaning that they were pro peace, and 56% claimed to be hawks. Well, after the Tet Offensive, a new poll was taken about a month or so after, and both sides tallied about 40%. So things started to definitely change. And one of the people that kind of brought that home, like you were saying, Tom, this idea of on the news and seeing, if you watch documentaries on Vietnam, you have actual journalists that are literally, there's
They're
bullets
there.
flying around them, and they're
Yeah.
like walking up to soldiers that are shooting, like shooting, literally in
They're
the
trying to
middle
hear
of the
you.
battle. And they're like, "How do you feel right now? How you want to talk about it?" And the guy's like, "I'd rather be home." And you start shooting again. It's surreal how real this was in the news every day. And then Walter Cronkite, who everyone, he was, the most respected journalist probably in American history. That's when he goes on TV after Tet Offensive and he's like, yeah, we're not winning this war. And that's when people are like, what's happening? And this is, 1968. And we should also mention that 1968 is the year that the United States had the most soldiers in Vietnam out of all the years and the most deaths in Vietnam. So, by 68, there was about 536,000 troops in Vietnam, the highest number out of all the years between 63 and 72. Again, just kind of showing how you have 68 being that pivotal year.
It
So,
was.
right. So, next thing that's kind of happening here because of Vietnam, another thing you have going here is there's some assassinations that happen. Again, before we get into the assassinations, let's talk a little bit about the civil rights movement up to that point. And because the civil rights movement changes around 60, between 65 and 68. Primarily, it changes because a lot of young African Americans, although the Civil Rights Act is passed, Civil Rights Act of 1964, that ultimately ends segregation, schools are desegregated. There's a big conversation between de facto segregation and de jure segregation, right?
The basic, yeah. So you're basically, the idea is basically, yeah, it's illegal, but it's still basically happening.
Yep.
So even though that they're going to acknowledge, right, it's illegal, yeah, we're not. There's no white and black water fountains and stuff like that. They're still finding. When I say they, people who want to segregate, want to keep their races separate, they're still finding ways. Whether it's things like poll taxes, which eventually become
Yep.
outlawed, right, or you're going to have those literacy tests, or you're going to have still neighborhoods, just
Which
the
are
people
hard. I
themselves.
mean, I try to give them to my
Oh yeah,
students. I'm like, guys,
that's,
like
yeah.
if you
They,
take
they
this
wouldn't pass.
test,
Yeah,
and they're like,
they wouldn't pass.
what? I mean, they were not meant for a person to pass.
No,
They
and
were.
it really what they weren't even really giving them to the white voters either. They were just giving them to the minority voters.
Absolutely.
So
So the fact of segregation kind of really intensified after the African Americans migrated to northern cities during and after World War II. And this kind of began what became known as white flight. So you have white people that chose to essentially move to the suburbs as opposed to stay in the cities. And then
yeah.
what happened is cities became predominantly African American and suburbs became predominantly white. And a lot of the money that was being spent on businesses, local businesses, and things like that were going to the suburbs. They were going away from the cities, which really kind of by 1960s, it created really the urban centers were decaying. There were slums.
Well, yeah, what you have is then the jobs are leaving,
Yep,
so the money's not being spent like you were saying.
and
So if
schools,
that's
even
not happening,
schools, right?
the
Because the white
schools and
kids weren't going to the city schools.
the schools are not getting the funding. So what's going to happen is you get that urban, like you were saying, and then there's no jobs. So a lot of the youth then, what happens, they join gangs, they resort to crime. That sort of really starts to take flight. Drugs become big.
So you're looking at this, and this another thing that kind of brings us to where you have a lot of tension now between white police and African American inner city, population.
Again, sound familiar? If we just don't
Right.
say this is 1968, they're going
Oh,
to
we could
assume
be
it's
talking about
2020.
today,
We
right?
can talk about yesterday. Yes, exactly.
In my mid 1960s, there's a lot of clashes between white authority, police officers, and black civilians, and it kind of spread like wildfire. So, in New York City, July 1964, there was an encounter with a white police officer and an African American teenager, and it resulted in the death of the 15-year-old teenager. And this sparked a massive race riot in central Harlem. Within a year, August 11th, 1965, just 5 days after President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, you have one of the worst riots in the nation's history ever, the Watts riot in Los Angeles. 34 people killed, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property destroyed. Then in 66, you see even more racial disturbances. And in 67 alone, riots and violent clashes take place in more than 100 cities. Again, like almost like looking in a mirror, 2020, 68.
And why do you think that's the case, though, Pete? You think it's a case of like just history repeating itself? It's a case of like, what was going on in the 60s, like what we're talking about today with 68, was the problem just not fixed?
I don't think,
Like,
yeah, that's
like,
that's honestly
yeah,
my
I
take.
think it was kind of just kind of brushed over, like kind of put like a little band-aid over it, but it wasn't enough to actually
Well, think about it.
fix it.
Yeah, by 2000, right? 28% of blacks in the South and 50% of blacks in the Northeast were attending schools with fewer than 10%
Yeah.
whites. Things haven't really changed. It's de facto versus the jury segregation. Yeah, by law, we're not segregated. But in fact, people are segregated. And
Yeah.
socioeconomically, they are segregated.
Yeah, socioeconomic. That's the big thing they're talking about. It's a socioeconomic factor that they're just brought. They just don't have the chances, basically, like
Yeah.
this or the same backgrounds.
And that leads
This
to frustration, and even led to when you have this urban violence erupting, it also leads to the splintering of the civil rights movement itself, and this is where the idea of Black Power is born. People believe that yes, segregation is over, and MLK was successful. However, he was unable. This nonviolence. A lot of young African Americans believe that this nonviolence didn't really lead to equality. And that's where Malcolm X comes in, and that's where Stokely Carmichael comes in, and that's where Black Panthers come in. A lot of people think that Black Panthers, oftentimes, if you look at pictures, and they dressed in black leather jackets, black berets, and sunglasses, and they had guns with them, and they followed police cars. But ultimately, the organization started in inner cities. Two reasons: one, to counter police brutality, and the other thing is these guys were about. I mean, they had soup kitchens. The Black Panthers, they had like lunch programs. The idea was to kind of really help, I guess, unfairness towards young African Americans. In 68, while this stuff is happening, we have these riots, the Black Panther movement is kind of taken away from MLK. And MLK actually kind of objected to Black Power movement. He believed that preaching violence could only end in grief. That was his view. He's planning to lead this Poor People's March in Washington, D.C., but he never really gets to that. So in 68, what happens, Tom?
Well, then in April 4th of 1968, Martin Luther King is actually visiting Memphis, Tennessee. And while there, he's standing on the second floor balcony of the Lauren Motel when he is struck by a bullet around 6 o'clock p.m. He was only 39 years old when time when this happened. He was rushed to a hospital where he never regained consciousness. Then about an hour later, he was pronounced dead. Obviously, the man that was found guilty of murdering him was James Earl Ray. He was captured shortly afterwards. The fingerprints were traced back to his gun.
He admitted to
He
it
did
at first, and then he
he
was
admitted
like,
to that first that he recanted, and I was doing research on this a while ago. And I'm not going to get into conspiracy theories, but there's members of King's own family. I don't believe that James Earl Ray was a
yeah,
murderer.
I think King's son met with
Yeah,
him in
yeah.
jail.
He didn't kill my dad.
Yeah,
Yeah, or he does eventually. James Earl Ray always tried to withdraw his guilty plea and get a new trial. Never did, and he
yeah,
did die in prison in 1998. And that's something that we can look at another time with that. But you were talking about before about the riots, and that's what one of the things. Like, obviously, King, famous individual, civil rights leader, but his death, when the news of his death starts to spread around the country, it actually leads to riots, which is
absolutely.
something that King would have not wanted, right?
Hmm.
But it does happen, particularly in Washington D.C. There's massive riots
Oh
that,
yeah, it was like 20,000 crowds of 20,000 overwhelmed. Like
yeah,
3,100 police members. Federal
and they
troops
just
are like
destroyed
12,000
yeah,
federal
they
troops
destroyed
are called in.
the downtown area of Washington D.C.
Yeah.
was just destroyed. It was burnt to the ground.
Yeah, I mean they brought in the Third Infantry to guard the White House, burned down buildings. Damages in Washington D.C. reached like $27 million, in 1960s money.
And this happened by 11 p.m. the day he was killed. Like it wasn't
Yeah,
like it happened days. It was like the same day he was killed as news spread. Man, this is the 60s, so there is like TV and news wires. It's not as fast as it would be today, but the news does spread rather quickly. By 11 p.m., there's riots not just in D.C. but 30 cities across the country, major cities across the country are rioting for their upset. Like this was our man, this was our voice. He's preaching nonviolence, and now he's getting us. And now he was shot and killed.
yeah, and again, very similar to what you see today. I mean, just beyond comprehensible damage, and people are frustrated, people are upset. Again, you have the military that comes out. The government comes out to fight against people because now there's again that distinction, as I mentioned before. Like, are we talking people that are protesting, or are we talking people that are rioting? It's different. Again, millions of dollars in damages, and it's not just Washington D.C. because I mean, after MLK's, it was like 100 cities exploded, in
Yeah,
flames. Baltimore was one of the big ones. Chicago, Kansas City, Washington D.C. Obviously, as we said before. 1968. People by that point are like, it's April. It's only April until like 1968. And then that they're not, we're not done in that year with assassinations. And the next
not just
assassination, um,
happens June 5th, right
yeah,
when R.F. Kennedy, right? Robert F. Kennedy, the younger brother of JFK, just a few years after his brother was assassinated. He's running for president. He's going to be running for president.
yeah,
And he was actually assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles,
Saran
right?
Saran.
Restaurant opened fire, hitting Kennedy in the head and back. He collapsed, was rushed to the hospital, underwent brain surgery, and he was pronounced dead the next day. He was only 42.
Yep. I think he looked at his wife. One of the last words was like,
Yeah.
is it bad or something like that?
Yeah, is it bad? Yeah, because he wasn't sure. And it was recently there was something with the he was like a busboy. I remember seeing something on the anniversary of his death this year. The busboy that was like
In the
he like
kitchen.
caught Kennedy as he was falling. Yeah, they brought him to the kitchen to like what was going on. Because what's surprising about this, and we'll get into more of it in a minute, but the surprising about this one is that Robert Kennedy, as famous as he was, he didn't have any security with him. They didn't get Secret Service protection yet. Now, like if you're a viable presidential candidate, you get protected. You have Secret Service protection. They didn't have this. So this guy just walked right up to him right after the speech. Sirhan just walked right up to him and opened fire. And I don't think they ever really got like a real reason why he did it.
Yeah. And
Right?
also, this
Sirhan,
is very important too because and this kind of brings us to our last thing, but another thing in this 1968. This is important because RFK, at least to the young people and the Democrats, was seen as hope. You know,
yeah. He was Kennedy's brother. He served with Kennedy, right? He was the attorney
yep,
general. This guy was going to be, all right, now we're getting another Kennedy back in the White House, right?
yep,
Because most people say if he ran, he had a really good chance of winning, just based on the popularity factor, the factor that, JFK was still so popular, he was going to kind of like ride that a little bit. He was a smart guy. He was well liked. He was
yep.
well liked in the party. So he had a really good chance of
And he was
winning.
also running on the idea. I mean, he was running the idea of equality and civil rights
He wanted to end the Vietnam
and
War.
Vietnam
Like,
War. Yeah, he was the guy that was the progressive answer
yeah.
to Lyndon Johnson, who was the old school establishment president. Ironically, Democrat. So that's different.
Last thing he's running against his own party. Yeah, he kind of
Yeah,
split away.
So
And
I
John,
think we should talk about that. That's another thing that you're looking at. Just politics are in complete disarray in '68.
oh yeah,
Thousands
well,
of Americans are dying. Young men are drafted into war. You have race riots throughout the nation. You have one of the most important 20th century leaders, MLK, just assassinated. You have a second Kennedy assassination in the same decade.
the hope of a generation.
Yeah, the hope of generation. I mean,
It's
things are
assassinated.
just literally crumbling in
Yeah,
1968. And then the one thing we kind of need to really talk about it is the disarray in the Democratic Party that is
yeah.
in control of, in the government at the time.
Which
Um,
happens in August of '68, right? It's just
yep,
like Democrats recently had their convention this year, which is all on
yep.
like
It just
online, right?
happened.
Or
Yeah, it just happened. It's online.
yeah,
But here, the
uh,
Democratic Party is splintering. This is the crazy thing. You have Lyndon Baines Johnson, first of all, has having a rough time. I mean, this guy, before Vietnam, institutes what is known as the Great Society program. And
which looks great on paper.
absolutely. Actually, if Vietnam didn't happen, it's a lot of those what ifs in history. But if Vietnam didn't happen, he would have probably been as revered as FDR. He would have been the second
Yeah,
FDR, with his New Deal versus Great Society. But that didn't really happen, obviously. I mean,
because you have to pay for Vietnam. You can't
yeah,
have
I mean,
wars are expensive. Yeah,
yeah, and I mean, LBJ used to wake up to chants outside the White House. LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? I mean, this guy was going
did
through a
someone
lot.
set fire to themselves on the White House lawn,
Yeah,
like right
yeah,
outside the White House? That's when he was like, "I'm not running again." That's
yeah.
pretty
He's like, I
basic.
can't do this, and that's kind of you. Good point, Tom. That's kind of where I was going with this. Is his own party in '68, '68 primary elections. Eugene McCarthy comes out of nowhere, and he's like, I'm going to challenge him for president. Like,
You're a sitting president. This would
yeah,
be like someone. This would be like a Republican saying, "I'm going to run against Trump."
yep, I'm running against Trump. It's just going
I'm
to
running
happen.
against Trump, which you don't do.
Yep,
It's be like Cruz saying, "I'm running against Trump." Like it's something that doesn't happen. You don't run against your incumbent president when he's looking for reelection. You
yep.
have to show that loyalty to your party. But the Democrats didn't have that in 1968.
No, no. Eugene McCarthy's like, I'm running, and I'm going to go against Vietnam. And my platform is all about ending the war in Vietnam. And he doesn't really. I mean, he's first of all, he's not really a known senator. It's March '68 in the New Hampshire Democratic primary. McCarthy gets about 42% of the vote, and Johnson wins the primary with 48% of the vote. So he won, but the slim margin of victory kind of was a defeat. Like he knows, like, wow, my own party is kind of against me. And that's also when Robert Kennedy, RFK, is like, all right, I wasn't going to throw my hat in the ring because I didn't think it was, like you said, I didn't think it was the right thing to do.
But someone else is doing it. I
He's like,
can,
I'm just going for it, and
yeah,
then
people are
he
encouraging
does.
too. They're saying this is the time to do it.
And then you have shocking, ultimately, you have famous LBJ speech where Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president of the United States, who is running for reelection, all of a sudden goes on national television.
He says, "I will not seek, and I will not
Accept, yeah,
basically, I
as
will
the
not."
nomination of my party for another term as your president. And people
What?
are like, what? Like, so he
Again,
basically quit.
yeah, he quits. He says,
Yeah.
"When my term is over, I'm done. I'm not coming back.
Yeah, I'm not doing this.
Too hard. I'm done."
Which is, again, more turmoil for '68. It's like, wait, what? Like, you have all these people that are still for him, and they're like, wait, so think about it. All
That's
the
what people
people
could
that
really
are pro
because
Vietnam and their kids are in Vietnam, they kind of feel like betrayed in a sense. It's like, this guy took my kids to Vietnam, and now he's like, yeah, I'm getting out.
yeah, it's like the country's in turmoil, and the president, the guy who's supposed to help them, the guy who's in charge, is like, I'm done. Like, I'm not. This is too much for me.
I mean,
Like that.
literally, the Democratic Party's
Go to the
falling
stomach. Yeah, they're
apart.
falling apart. And then it really comes ahead, and then the people are frustrated, and that's what comes ahead in August, right, at the
Yep.
Democratic National
All
Convention in
right, all
Chicago,
right. So go ahead. So what happens?
where the what happens basically is a lot of anti-war protesters there, and they get in a battle with police. All right,
Hmm.
and and this has happened before, but what the difference is because there's so much news people there,
There's like
and
10,000 protesters too.
yeah, because of the Democratic National Convention, all everything gets captured. Okay, like all gets videotaped, so it's all broadcast on the national televised audience. So a lot of
Yep.
these people, for the first time, they're seeing some of this. That's what you see in the civil rights movement too. When people, it's one thing if you hear about how people are getting, dogs sicked at them or shot with fire hoses, then you
Yep.
actually see it. It's a lot different.
Yep.
So it's the first time a lot of people in the country are seeing this, and it led to a huge expansion of the anti-war protests. But what it also did is it really scared a lot of people. And this is
Absolutely.
what opens the door for Nixon to become president because Nixon talks about this
Oh,
in his
he's totally
campaign.
a like
He
beneficiary.
uses
He's like, all right, this is perfect.
and he says what this is I'm appealing to the silent majority of Americans who do not go out and protest, who are frightened by seeing this protest and this anarchy that we're seeing in the streets. So a lot of the protesters are viewed as these dangerous radicals, right? These like
Hmm.
anarchists. I want to overthrow the government. And if you don't want the government to be overthrown, vote for Nixon. He's a law and order candidate. Okay.
Yeah.
Again, sound familiar?
Yeah. Right.
Like it's the same stuff. As I'm just saying it, I'm just like getting these like images in my head of like just watching, the speeches on TV from the Trumps and Trump supporters. Okay,
Yep.
again, not getting political on this podcast,
Yep.
but you're just seeing the same rhetoric on both sides, where one side's calling the other side radicals, or you're seeing the protests. Oh, they're protesting. They're not doing it for they're not protesters. They're thugs, right?
Hmm.
Send in the forces, send in the police to and tear gas them and things like that. It's the same narrative happening in 1968 and in 2020 over different reasons, but also the core reason of racial inequality.
Hmm. Absolutely.
So it's very interesting. I mean, there is so much that we can go into with this. Obviously, we're
And
just kind of
yep.
going on the
And
surface here,
people could
but
see this. I mean, you guys could YouTube this, and there's plenty, people that listen to a podcast too that were alive during this time. They could remember this. When I talked to some people that were teenagers or adults in '68, and I talked to them about just today, and I keep on saying, they're saying, "Oh, 2020, right?" But they tell me, this too shall pass. They say, I lived through the '60s. I lived in '68, and we thought the world was falling apart, and we got through it. At this national convention, Democratic National Convention, I mean, there was like 12,000 Chicago police officers, like over 5,000 National Guard. Talk about like militarizing it. And they, these police officers with cameras focused, like you're saying, on them, they move into the crowd and they spray protesters with mace. They beat them with nightsticks. And there's videos of protesters all bloody, screaming. The whole world is watching, as it's, again, it's surreal what you're seeing. Hotels, nearby hotels in downtown Chicago had to be turned into like makeshift hospitals and aid stations. I mean, this is just
it's crazy.
surreal. Surreal, yeah. Um,
Especially if you're an American, you hear about this stuff, but you're watching on TV for the first time, especially in like the Midwest,
yeah,
and you're seeing this, what's going on, and you're scared.
yeah.
You still might have that trust in the government and everything like that, and it's when Nixon comes and he's saying that law and order appeal, that's what gets him elected. That's what helps gets him elected. I really feel, and a lot of historians will say this, without that riot at the '68 convention, Nixon doesn't become president.
Yeah, I agree. I concur
And
with
sitting
that.
with RFK, I think RFK, if he wasn't assassinated,
Yeah. There's
he
so many
probably
what
wouldn't.
ifs in history, It's so interesting.
But just in this year, you have, or in the span of a few months at this point,
Yeah, talk about the
this
first 6 months, right? Watch first 6 months, Tom, of 1968, right? 40,000 students on more than 100 campuses took part in more than 200 major demonstrations, right? I mean, crazy. In New York City, right?
about this,
Columbia
like,
University, I think it was 68. It was in 68. Columbia University, in April, students protesting the university's community policies take over buildings. And police eventually has to restore order. And like they arrested 900 protesters because they took over Columbia University. I mean, surreal. And then, like, before we move on from the political aspect here, then you have George Wallace kind of puts his, hat in the ring, as they say. And George Wallace is a former Alabama governor, and he's the third party candidate, and he doesn't win. He also gets shot. Actually, that's a whole other story. But he was a longtime champion of school segregation, states' rights. What was considered by many at the time to be very racially charged policies, and he gets a decent amount of votes. And that also kind of scares a lot of Americans that there's still the
people voting for this guy. Yeah,
yeah, like there's still people out there that that vote for this guy and want this guy absolutely. Again, I actually had a few students when this corona thing started. I had a few students reach out to me in the last few months of the school year when we were already in lockdown, and they were like, I can't, one student said, I can't watch TV, I can't watch the news, I don't, Mr. Z, like what's going on here? And I told him that same thing, like, you have to look at history and look at it, pointed them to 1968. For many people that were your age, it seemed to be very, very similar. As different as it is, obviously, it is very similar. You know, you and I kind of talked briefly about a couple other things that happened at 68. That might, I guess, that might fall into. I mean, I don't know if we could
For
call it
one, I would
fun
like to say,
facts.
well, before we get to that, there's another big event that I would like to bring up. That kind of just it's kind of like put maybe a bow on the whole civil rights issues, some of the
Hmm.
civil rights issues of the 60s. So we have obviously leaders being killed, we have the riots, but you also have protests that are taking place, similar to what you're seeing just recently, how the NBA that they protested in some of the Black Lives Matter
Yep.
movement, how they refused to play in some of those playoff games, right? During the
Hmm.
week. This, I think Friday they started playing again, and that was in October of '68. You actually had the Summer Olympics taken on Mexico City, and I'm sure you remember this.
Yep.
You know what I'm talking about here with the two American medalists, Tommy Smith and John Carlos. After they win the 200-meter race, they're awarded the gold and bronze medals, and as the Star Spangled Banner is played, they bow their heads and raise their fist in the air with a black glove on
Glove.
it,
Yep.
and they are actually booed as they are leaving
Yep.
the Olympic Stadium from doing this.
And they took him away. They actually took their medals away.
Well, they get kicked off the team
Yep.
shortly after.
Yep. And they're
Um,
no longer able to represent the United States.
yeah, 2 days later, they were expelled from the team, and then but when they came home, they were hailed as heroes by members of the African American community. Now, nowadays, when they interview them, when they interview, actually, a guy who gets a lot of interview is the Australian Peter Norman. He was the
Hmm.
Australian who won the silver medal, because he didn't wear the glove, but he wore the same pins that they wore,
Hmm.
and he supported their decision. They told him they were going to do it ahead of time. He's like, "Yeah, go for it," So yeah, now they're looked as heroes, but in this time they weren't. They
Yep.
were really looked at as like, how dare you bring politics into the Olympic Games?
Yeah, it was like the kneeling thing, except
Yeah, like,
they.
how
Yep.
you do this? But it's like, well, we know it's on TV. We're going to bring attention to our cause. We're going to bring attention to the plight of what's going on in our country. They meant that as a peaceful kind of, like, you want to call it a protest, bring awareness, whatever, however they want to say it. But yeah, it caused a lot of hatred and a
Hmm.
lot of anger that they would do this. Yeah, they were threatened, obviously, stuff like that, and it just kind of shows that there was just doing something like that. It's just a lot of that racial tension still in the United States, as you still have today. But people were really upset by this.
Yep.
Just rating them doing what they did. They thought it was taken away from the national anthem. How dare you do that? Just like what you saw, yeah, like you were saying, Pete, with the kneeling
Yep.
before football games, basketball games, all that stuff. Yeah.
And what else you got for 68? Again, it seems like, I mean, again, fun facts are not fun facts, but there's a lot of things that are happening in 68. Obviously, based on what we said, it was a terrible year to say the least. But
What do
there's
you want?
some interesting things happening, right? That may not
Another,
necessarily be
right,
negative.
we were talking about this right before we
Yep.
I think started to record, but in November of 1968, one of your favorite shows, right, Star Trek,
Yep.
right, the original Star Trek series, actually has the first time on American television, the first interracial kiss,
Yep.
when Captain Kurt
And
is
Uhura. Yep.
kisses Uhura, and I think isn't he being like controlled? They're being. I never
It
saw
is.
this.
It is. Yeah. So to make it more acceptable, even though they were completely breaking barriers, they were being controlled by this like out of this world power that made them do it. But still, I mean, monumental in a sense.
I know that, like, it was on NBC. They made them film an alternate version because they were afraid that certain, like, TV affiliates in the South particularly would refuse to show it. And then Shatner, William Shatner, who was
Yep.
like really supportive of this interracial kiss, he knew what it was going to be. So he purposely like ruined all the alternative takes. So the only take that they could actually use was the interracial one. Like whenever they made him kiss like a white woman, he just like messed it up on purpose
Yeah.
and stuff like that, like
I
licked
did
her
read
nose
that.
or something. He was doing it on purposely just to have that. And then apparently in the episode, I found this quote. Kurt says in the line, "Where I come from, size, shape, or color makes no difference." That's what Kirk says in the episode. Kind of, again, it's supposed to take place in the future, but they're kind of like referencing, that Earth at some point gets over this whole issue.
Absolutely.
So
Um,
I thought that was kind of interesting. Yeah,
I agree.
it's just like things like this that how like really it shouldn't be that big of a deal, right?
Yep.
If you think about it, like I'm sure the kids say like, well, what does that even matter, right? But in the 1968, that's a big deal. Showing us on national televised TV, right? A white man and an African American woman kissing on TV, like that's just like wow, oh my god. Because remember, up until it was actually illegal for that even to happen.
Yep. It was.
Look at the book I'm sure everybody reads in English class, right? To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yep.
Right? You don't. That's something that's not supposed to happen. That's not right. That's not what society says is okay. And here they're having it on TV, which is a form of entertainment, right? A form of escape. And they're making this like social statement on TV, and it's a big deal. It's trying to also show them how television is evolving too, where it's not just going to be that Leave It to Beaver type of stuff anymore.
Yep. Absolutely.
So I just thought,
No, I think that's November. It was in November, right?
yeah, November.
Yeah, it was November. Some of the other things that kind of come out of '68, when and I think that's a conversation we could be having about 2020 today, and where do we go from here? And again, I'm a firm believer that things will get better, but some of the changes, long term implications. After Nixon wins, right? So he carries 32 states. He kind of starts this like long stretch of Republican dominance, in the White House. And actually because of the White House, also the Supreme Court, as we know, the president gets to appoint judges to the Supreme Court. So you have, the GOP wins like 5 of the 6 presidential races in that period. 2 by Nixon, 2 by Reagan, and 1 by George Bush. Not until Jimmy Carter. So that's kind of how much the Democratic Party tarnished itself with how they dealt with the turmoil that was happening.
They really don't start to get looked at. Well, they were by their followers, but looked at as a positive light. They don't have that beacon because Jimmy Carter was a great man, but he's not seen as a great president.
No, by no means.
That
guy's still alive. God bless.
He's still alive. Yeah. Well, he's won the Nobel Prize, I believe, since his presidency, like Peace Prize. But really, you don't see like a big time Democratic presidential candidate or president really until Clinton.
Yeah.
But as far as like popularity and as far as just like that widespread appeal, because he did appeal to Republicans also, Clinton.
Yeah.
Especially during his first term.
I think that kind of just about wraps it up for us. Thanks for joining us, guys, and until next week, Pete signing off.
Tom Reska, take it easy, guys.
I hope everyone enjoyed our podcast, and if you would like to email us, you can do so at historyteacherspodcast@gmail.com.